Hi, everybody. Well, tonight I'm continuing with Seedfolks. This is chapter 10. It's titled Nora. I always try to get Mr. Miles out for a walk and a taste of fresh air. I don't know about his other nurses. I expect that it's because I'm British. Back in England, you'd see mothers pushing infants in prams through the winter gales. I expect as well it was the sight of my own father, vegetating in his chair by the fire. We mustn't stop living before our time. So I'm forever telling Mr. Miles. It was a midsummer morning, and I was pushing his wheelchair on Gibb Street, a new route for us. The view, I'll admit, is less than uplifting. Half the storefront seemed to be empty. Mr. Miles must remember a very different scene. His landlady says he's lived here many years. As he lost his speech with his second stroke, he can't tell me himself. He's a mystery. Lately, his interest in the world has declined. I'd stop before a store window to let him see him for himself. He has the dignified head of an African chief, only to find that he'd fallen asleep. I realized that his time might be near, and then that morning, rolling along the sidewalk, suddenly his arm came up. I wanted to stop. I obliged him at once. Or he wanted to stop. I obliged him at once. To our left was a lot in which a few bold pioneers had planted gardens. We remained several minutes, watching two Asian women hoeing, then continued on. Immediately, back up went his arm. I came around and looked at him. He twisted and pointed toward the garden. I turned the wheelchair and headed back. I could see his nostrils taking in the smell of the soil. We reached the lot. His arm commanded me to enter. Over the narrow, bumpy path we went, his nose and eyes working. Some remembered scent was pulling him. He was a salmon traveling upstream through his past. That first day, we simply watched the others. We might have been strolling through a miniature city. Some plots sported brick pathways and flower borders, while others looked haphazard. One had a gate that was, in fact, a car door. Within, beans climbed a propped-up set of bed springs, a hummingbird feeder, a barbecue grill, a gardening hat hanging from a nail. There were many such domestic touches. I was entranced. I determined that Mr. Miles should do more than simply watch, wheelchair or no. I worked on the problem in my head. 2 days later, driving to his apartment, I stopped at the garden and unloaded a large plastic trash barrel and shovel. I wheeled him up an hour later, used my pocket knife to cut holes in the bottom of the barrel for drainage, and built up a fine sweat shoveling in dirt. I brought with me a dozen seed packets. Mr. Miles chose the flowers decisively, ignoring the vegetables. Was he recalling his mother's flower garden? His history is unknowable. I pushed him as close to the barrel as I could. 30 minutes later, he'd planted hollyhocks and poppies and snapdragons. Riding home afterward, he smelled the dirt on his fingers with satisfaction. That small circle of earth became a second home to both of us. Gardening boring? Never. It was suspense and tragedy, startling developments, a soap opera growing out of the ground. I'd forgotten that tremolo of expectation produced by a tiny forest of sprouts. What a marvelous sight it was to behold. Mr. Miles' furrowed black face inspecting his smooth-skinned young, just arrived in the world he'd shortly leave. His eyes gained back some of their life. He weeded and watered with great concentration. A fact bobbed up from my memory that the ancient Egyptians prescribed walking through a garden as a cure for the mad. It was a mind-altering drug we took daily. We were rather alone there, off to one side. Our most common visitors were the cats. They were attracted by the aroma of fish, the work of a child who'd copied the pilgrims of old and buried sardines with her seeds. Then our solitary status ended as a result of a downpour. When the rain came that day, the other gardeners all ran in the same direction as if in a fire drill. We followed and found them sheltered beneath a shoe store's overhang 2 doors down, apparently their customary refuge. The small, dry space forced us together. In 15 minutes, we'd met them all and soon knew the whole band of regulars. Most were old. Many grew plants from their native lands. Huge Chinese melons, ginger, cilantro, a green the Jamaicans called cataloo, and many more. Pantomime was often required to get over language barriers. Yet we were all subject to the same weather and pests, the same neighborhood, and the same parental emotions toward our plants. If we happened to miss 2 or 3 days, people stopped by on our return to ask about Mr. Miles' health. We, like our seeds, were now planted in the garden. I told all this to out-of-town guests, then took them up Terminal Tower. We got off at the observation deck on the 42nd floor to find that the garden, which loomed so large to its tenders, was hopelessly hidden from view by buildings. I looked at all the tourists who'd no notion it existed, who thought they were seeing all of Cleveland, and restrained myself from pointing and shouting, "The Gibbs Street Garden is there." And the next chapter is titled Maricela. If you're Mexican, the Cubans and Puerto Ricans don't like you because they think you snuck in illegally, and they didn't, which they would have if they could have walked. If you're a teenager, the whole world dislikes you. If you're a pregnant teenager, people think you should be burned at the stake. I'm a Mexican, pregnant 16-year-old. I wouldn't actually care how people think. In a way, I don't feel very much alive. I'm used to being really, really hot. Because of the baby, I'm fat as a wrestler. I dropped out of school. I've been to exactly 0 parties, including by the man who got me pregnant. My parents were mad. They wanted me to graduate. Then they sort of got excited about the baby. They both loved little babies. They started praying for it every night. 3 of us from my high school got into this program for pregnant teens. They give you rides to the doctor and help with getting your GED at home. Great. Except that Penny, the woman we see, saw the community garden and got the program its own spot to give us practice taking care of something and to let us witness the miracle of life, and to try to keep us from eating our babies alive or dropping them. It was already the middle of summer, so she had us plant radishes since they grow fast. We don't like radishes. As soon as the little green leaves came up, a gopher or something wiped them out. So much for the miracle of life. I didn't tell Penny that, though. She's so cheerful I could never. After the radishes came squash, then Swiss chard, which nobody knew how to eat. I was in my 7th month. I didn't like bending to weed. We all complained, but Penny just smiled. I didn't like the feel of dirt under my nails. One afternoon, Yolanda broke 2 of her fancy painted, very expensive nails. Penny couldn't keep her quiet. Then another woman came over and gave us this long lecture about the word decorum. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was my old 3rd grade teacher, Miss Fleck. I prayed she wouldn't recognize me, but naturally she did, and asked me all the usual questions. I should have had the answers printed out on a card to hand out. The next week, when some man threw a can out his window, which landed about a foot from my head, Miss Fleck figured out what apartment he was in, walked up, and yelled at him like he was a kid. Different people came to our part of the garden for different reasons. This Puerto Rican kid had these pumpkin plants that kept getting into ours, which gave him an excuse to walk right past me and talk to Dolores, who was 15 and pretty. I couldn't wait for her to get noticed. Sometimes this black guy ran through our garden. He couldn't take time to go around. He grew lettuce, or tried to. Most of it had died. He'd drive up in a cab, slam on the brakes like the Pope just stepped in front of him, run through our squash, cut a bunch of lettuce, and run back with it in a bucket of water. Then he'd drive fast, leaving lots of rubber on the pavement. Then there were the people who came by to give us different things. Vegetables that they'd grown and thought we should eat, which we always gave away later. Advice on growing Swiss chard. Advice on giving birth and raising kids. One day in August, it was just me and Penny. This black woman, Leona, who had a garden and talked to us, came over and gave me some flowers she'd grown. They were yellow. She called them goldenrod, and she said if I made them into tea, it would help me when I delivered the baby. She knew I didn't really want to be pregnant. I could talk to her about it. That day was almost too humid to talk. The window around the garden was open, and you could hear 10 different TVs and radios. A storm was coming. The thunder was getting closer, and then it hit. Bam! Then all the TVs and radios went off, and so did the lights. It was a power failure. It was quiet in the garden without all the noise. So quiet it was weird. I looked around. An old man near us was slowly picking cucumbers, like nothing had happened. Whole city shuts down, but the garden just keeps going, Leona said. She talked on, how plants don't run on electricity or clock time, how none of nature did, how nature ran on sunlight and rain and seasons, and how I was part of that system. The word sort of put me into a daze. My body was part of nature. I was related to bears and dinosaurs and plants, to things that were 1,000,000 years old. It hit me that this system was much older and stronger than the other. She said how it wasn't some disgrace to be part of it. She said it was an honor. I stared at the squash plants. It was a world in there. It seemed like I could actually see the leaves and flowers growing and changing. I was in that weird daze, and for just that minute, I was so glad I was pregnant. Well, that's both chapters for tonight. And we are all gathered. We are all one. We are all one in this world. Black and white, Asian, African American, Native American, European. We are all loved by God, and we're all part of this world. And I hope we can all work together to make it a better place. Let's pray. Good and gracious God, thank you for loving us, each and every one of us. People who look like us, and people who don't look like us. Help us to love everyone and to reach out and be their friend and to help each other in this world. And Lord, help us to sleep in peace tonight, knowing you are awake. Amen. Good night, everyone.